All right, so let's move on to the game with my Michigan Wolverines. They were taking on the number 13 Wisconsin Badgers last week. They lose that game by a score of 49-11. And I said it in the post-game show that I made for this. It was one of probably the worst football games I've watched in a long time. And the first half was probably the most unprepared I've seen a football team be in a long time. The first two passes that Joe Milton threw were interceptions. One of them wasn't his fault. It was just a drop pass by Nick Eubanks, but the other one was just a horrendous pass. And Michigan does not look good. And we're going to get to sort of Jim Harbaugh and the other parts of the coaching staff in a second and sort of what we think that their next moves should be. But let's take a look at the box score real quick. Joe Milton was 9 for 19, only 98 yards and the 2 interceptions like I was saying. He actually got pulled in the third quarter, brought in Cade McNamara, who led actually a pretty good first drive that he was in the game. 3 plays, I think he went something like 74 yards. And I think it's going to be really interesting because I think that Joe Milton could lose his starting job. And I think it could be Cade McNamara under center next week. But other than that, they switched up the defense. They were playing like a 3-2. They were no good, although Vincent Gray got a little bit better. But let's move on to Jim Harbaugh. Noah, we'll get your opinion first because I know that Muschamp just got fired yesterday. I mean, what's your opinion sort of with all of this coaching stuff that's going on?
Yeah, 100%. Our head ball coach just got let go yesterday, Will Muschamp, and I agree with the move. A lot of people are saying right now, because it's a COVID season, that it's not fair to make judgments for the coaches to be able to go out there and do their best still with COVID and everything going on. But at the end of the day, if you're Michigan or if you're South Carolina and your team is starting to lose games or at least getting smacked by margins that you're not supposed to be losing by, even if it was a regular season, there's just that factor that's like, okay, something's got to change here. This can't always be a COVID problem. We can't always bring it back to COVID. That can't be the problem for this program, especially Michigan. Michigan was a team with very high hopes going into this game. They beat Minnesota the first game of the season. They're looking great, and then they dropped the next 3. There has to be something that's going on in that locker room because Michigan just doesn't drop 3 games straight to Michigan State, then Indiana, and then Wisconsin is a good team, a good program, but that's just very uncharacteristic of such an elite blue blood of college football in Michigan that you got to think, you know what, it's time for a change because Michigan's expectation isn't to make a bowl game every year. Their fans won't be happy if you just go out and make some bowl like the Outback Bowl or the Gator Bowl or the Citrus Bowl or whatever bowl they played against in Alabama last year. That's not the Michigan standard. The Michigan standard that they want to start seeing their team play in Indianapolis. They want to see their team make the Big Ten championship. They want to see their team go on to a playoff and play there. And that's something that Jim Harbaugh has not been able to give Michigan at all. He hasn't been able to give them a win against Ohio State, which is mainly the key factor into why they've never got to Indianapolis or they've never got to a playoff spot because they've had their chances against Ohio State. They've had the time where they were ranked over them and Jim Harbaugh and the Wolverines just couldn't execute it. So you're probably just thinking to yourself, you know what, it's time for a change over there in Ann Arbor. And I honestly do think that it's time for a change. We just did it in South Carolina. Even though it is a COVID season, there are just some things that you got to say, you know what, this just isn't working out anymore. We got to do better as a football program. So Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, I think that it might be time for him to go.
All right, so I've sort of given my opinion on this in the previous videos, but I mean, Jim Harbaugh, he's predictable. The whole coaching staff is becoming really predictable. The thing about, I think for me, it comes down to the play calling. And I know that a lot of people who watch the Wisconsin game would say the exact same thing. I mean, the one play that I really highlight of the Wisconsin one that sort of just left me shaking my head was Michigan has the 4th down on the Wisconsin 1. Michigan comes out in the shotgun. Wisconsin calls a timeout, and Michigan comes out in the exact same look and ends up not scoring. Now this is, I think they were down 28-0 at the time, and they ended up not scoring at all. But I mean, it didn't make sense to me. And they come out in the same look, and that's just sort of an example. But their play calling in general is really predictable. And it's not only Jim Harbaugh, but we could look over to the defense as well and look at Don Brown. They look like they're extremely unprepared every time they play zone. They've switched to man, back to zone coverage. They look like they haven't practiced the schemes. They can't find an identity. And I mean, I know it's partly the players' fault as well, but I mean, these are still really talented players. I know we lost a lot of players, especially on the defense, but these are, really talented guys. And I think Michigan's just failing to develop. I think they're failing to create a scheme that sort of works for the players that they have. And then offensively, I think Josh Gaddis is going to end up going at the end of the year as well. But I mean, I just really hope that Michigan can figure it out for at least the end of the year, because I don't see any of them getting fired until the end of the season. And I mean, I just hope that Michigan can sort of figure everything out.
One thing that I definitely like to see from Michigan, especially if I was a Michigan fan, is the lack of NFL talent that has been coming out, especially in the draft and everything like that, has been below standards of late, definitely out of the Jim Harbaugh era. You look before, obviously, Michigan's still pumping guys out to the NFL, no question about it. You had guys like Rashawn Gary and who's the other guy?
Well, we sent 10 last
Devin
year
Bush.
to the NFL.
Yeah, but more first rounders, more those guys. You want to see guys highlighted from Michigan in those draft boards and everything. You want to see guys from Michigan in the top 10 and everything. And I just haven't seen that since Rashawn Gary and Devin Bush. There hasn't really been anyone else that I see that's a first-round talent in a while, especially on the offensive side of the ball, where you want wide receivers, you want running backs, you want guys like that, quarterbacks and stuff like that at Michigan to go high on these draft boards. And I just haven't seen that in a while for Michigan. And their draft classes have been good. I mean, their recruiting classes have been good. So that just tells you about what you said before. Player development at Michigan, I feel like it isn't at its best right now. And that's something that all relies on the coaching and the coaching staff all in all. And that all funnels into the head coach. The head coach determines what happens with the rest of the staff and everything. So that's something that if you're the AD right now, you got to look at that and you got to say, you know what, maybe we got to get someone in who's actually going to do the most with what we have right now at Michigan. And the most with what they have right now could be a national championship contending team, because like I said before, they have the talent on this team. It's just development and execution on the field that is the problem for Michigan right now.
I mean, I just think an example sort of what you were talking about before about the player development again is Joe Milton is actually the first quarterback to start for Michigan that was recruited by Jim Harbaugh. And I mean, obviously it looks like Milton's going to be not even the starter after 4 weeks if Cade McNamara plays last week. But I mean, that just shows the player development as well. They're not getting players ready to play. They're not very deep this year. Even though they have talent, they just don't have guys who can fit into the same system. And I think it starts with Harbaugh. I think it goes on to the other coaches as well. But I think Joe Milton and him being the first Harbaugh recruited quarterback is a great example sort of what we're talking about.
Some guys on the board for Michigan to come into Michigan next year, if these guys are still available. I know one guy that's been highly talked about is Hugh Freeze, who is Liberty's current head coach, and he was Ole Miss's head coach prior to that. He'd be a good guy, offensive-minded guy that you need at Michigan, because college football is changing into an offensive mindset kind of game. Defense is kind of taking a step back in college football. It's all about the offense now. If you want to be an elite team, you need to have an offense. So a guy like Hugh Freeze is going to work his tail off in recruiting. He's going to work his tail off to develop these players as best as possible. And he's going to be an offensive mind to really get that offense rolling. So he is one of the top candidates that if Michigan does make the decision to pull the trigger and let go of Jim Harbaugh, he is a guy that you could see in the maize and blue next year on the sideline.
Yeah, I think their next coach, if Harbaugh does leave this year, is going to be from one of those teams this year that are doing good from the non-Power 5 schools. But my only concern is that with J.J. McCarthy coming in next year. Now, I know when teams sort of bring in those type of recruiting classes, they don't want to fire the head coach because a lot of time the recruit has a good relationship with the head coach. So my only worry would be that Michigan has to be very, very careful with switching Harbaugh or switching Josh Gaddis if J.J. McCarthy is close with those two guys.